The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of St. Andrew's Memorial Chapel as I stood in the back corner, invisible among the sea of black umbrellas and tear-stained faces. My sister Natalie's casket lay beneath a cascade of white lilies, draped in the American flag she had earned through 2 tours in Afghanistan, the same flag my family seemed to forget had anything to do with me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I watched from the shadows as my mother Patricia clutched my father Robert's arm, their faces etched with the kind of grief that makes headlines. My older brother Michael stood behind them, his wife and 2 children flanked around him like a perfect portrait of family unity. The chapel was packed with hundreds of mourners, colleagues from the hardware store, old high school friends, distant relatives who hadn't spoken to Natalie in years, but suddenly appeared to claim their piece of her legacy. But as I scanned the crowd, as I listened to speaker after speaker rise to share memories of my sister, something became crystal clear. They had forgotten me completely. Not one person mentioned my name. Not one story included the sister who had been by Natalie's side through every deployment, every nightmare, every triumphant homecoming. It was as if Claire Donovan had never existed. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly understand, was that in exactly 14 minutes, 10 members of the Army Honor Guard would march through those chapel doors. And when they did, everything my family believed about Natalie, everything they thought they knew about her service, would shatter like glass against stone. My name is Claire Donovan, and for 28 years, I was the sister who didn't quite fit the mold my family had carved out for the Donovan legacy. While my parents poured their hearts into our third-generation hardware store on Millbrook's Main Street, while my brother Michael learned the business from the ground up and married his high school sweetheart right on schedule, I chose a different path. I became a social worker, spending my days in the county children's services office, fighting for kids who had been forgotten by the very people who should have protected them. Maybe that's why I recognized the signs so early. Maybe that's why I knew what it felt like to be invisible in your own family long before Natalie's funeral made it official. Growing up in the Donovan household meant understanding your place in the carefully constructed hierarchy my parents had built. Michael was the golden son, the heir apparent who would carry on the family business. Natalie was the baby, the beautiful surprise who could do no wrong, whose every smile melted my father's stern exterior, and whose every accomplishment became my mother's favorite dinner party story. And then there was me sandwiched between them, neither the responsible eldest nor the cherished youngest, just Claire, who tried too hard and never quite measured up. I still remember the Christmas morning when I was 12 years old. I had saved my allowance for months to buy my mother a delicate silver bracelet from the jewelry store downtown. I wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, practiced what I would say when she opened it, imagined the way her face would light up with pride. Christmas morning came, and she unwrapped gift after gift, exclaiming over Michael's handmade wooden jewelry box, gushing over Natalie's finger-painted portrait of our house. When she reached my carefully wrapped bracelet, she smiled politely, said it was lovely, and set it aside. I found it weeks later, still in its box, tucked away in her dresser drawer beneath old receipts and forgotten papers. That became the pattern of my childhood. The careful gestures that went unnoticed, the achievements that earned brief nods instead of celebration, the slow realization that no matter how hard I tried, I would always be the daughter they loved but didn't quite see. When I graduated valedictorian from Millbrook High, my parents attended the ceremony, but the celebration dinner afterward focused on Michael's new promotion at the store. When I earned my master's degree in social work, they were proud, they said, but couldn't understand why I wanted to work with other people's problems instead of contributing to the family business. Natalie was different though. From the moment she took her first steps toward me instead of our parents, she saw me in a way the rest of them never did. She was 3 years younger, but somehow she understood that I needed someone to choose me, someone to believe that I mattered. We became inseparable, sharing secrets under blanket forts, staying up late whispering about dreams and fears that our parents wouldn't understand. When she was 8 and I was 11, she told me she wanted to be just like me when she grew up. It was the first time anyone had ever said that to me. As we got older, Natalie and I developed our own language of inside jokes and meaningful glances across the dinner table. While our parents discussed business ventures and Michael's latest accomplishments, we would catch each other's eyes and smile, knowing we had something they couldn't touch. She was the one person in my family who truly saw me, who valued my opinion, who called me when she needed advice, or just wanted to hear a familiar voice. We were sisters in the truest sense, bonded not just by blood, but by choice, by the quiet understanding that we would always have each other's backs. When Natalie announced during her junior year of college that she was joining the Army National Guard, the family's reaction was predictably mixed. My parents worried about the danger, about her missing family events, about how deployment would affect their carefully planned holiday gatherings. Michael questioned whether it was a wise career move, whether she had thought through the long-term implications for her future. But I understood immediately. Natalie had always been drawn to service, to the idea of protecting others, of being part of something bigger than herself. It was the same instinct that had led me to social work, the same desire to make a difference in the world beyond our small-town hardware store. I was the one who drove her to the recruitment office. I was the one who helped her study for her entrance exams. I was the one who stood in the audience, tears streaming down my face, when she graduated from basic training. And when she received her orders for Afghanistan, I was the one she called first, before our parents, before anyone else. We talked for 2 hours that night, her voice shaking with excitement and terror, mine steady with the kind of support I had learned to give in my work with children facing uncertain futures. The months of her first deployment were some of the hardest of my life. Not because I feared for her safety, though that fear lived in my chest like a constant ache, but because her absence revealed just how isolated I had become in my own family. Without Natalie there to bridge the gap, to include me in conversations, to make sure I wasn't forgotten, I felt more invisible than ever. Dinner conversations revolved around the store, around Michael's children, around anything except the daughter who called me every week from a base in Kabul, to share stories she couldn't tell anyone else. I became Natalie's lifeline to home, and she became mine to purpose. She would tell me about the children she met during humanitarian missions, the schools they were helping to rebuild, the women they were training to read. I would share stories from my caseload, the small victories and heartbreaking setbacks that came with trying to piece together broken families. We understood each other's work, in a way our family never could, the weight of caring for others, the responsibility of standing between vulnerability and harm. When she came home after her first tour, she was different. Quieter in some ways, more intense in others. She had seen things that aged her beyond her 25 years, experienced losses that carved permanent lines around her eyes. But she was also more confident, more sure of herself and her purpose. She spent her leave time visiting local veterans organizations, speaking at high schools about military service, volunteering at the VA hospital in Columbus. And through it all I was her constant companion, the person she trusted to understand the complexity of readjusting to civilian life, while knowing you would soon leave again. Our parents were proud, of course. They bragged to their friends about their daughter the soldier, displayed her military portrait prominently in the store, shared her deployment photos on social media, with captions about American heroes. But they didn't understand the depth of her service, the personal cost of her choices, the way she carried the weight of every mission, every person she couldn't save, every letter she had to write to families back home. That understanding lived between Natalie and me, in the late-night phone calls and quiet conversations that no one else was invited to join. When her second deployment came, I thought I was better prepared. I had learned to navigate family gatherings without her, to find my own space in conversations that naturally excluded me. But this deployment was different. The frequency of her calls changed, the lightness in her voice dimmed, and I began to sense something she wasn't telling me. It wasn't until months later that I would understand what she had been protecting me from, what secrets she had been carrying, what promises she had made that would change everything. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was sitting in my office at the Children's Services Building, reviewing case files and preparing for a court hearing, when my phone rang. The voice on the other end was professional, measured, careful with its words. There had been an incident during a convoy operation outside Kandahar. An improvised explosive device. Natalie's unit had been providing security for a humanitarian supply run to a remote village when the attack occurred. She had been critically injured, and was being airlifted to a military hospital in Germany. I remember the way the room seemed to tilt, the way my hands shook as I wrote down information about flights and contact numbers and medical updates. I remember calling my parents, the strangled sound my mother made when I told her what had happened, the way my father's voice cracked as he tried to ask practical questions about logistics and time zones. We were on a plane to Germany within 18 hours, sitting in uncomfortable silence, each of us lost in our own prayers and fears. The hospital in Germany was a maze of sterile corridors and hushed voices. Natalie was unconscious when we arrived, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed, and kept track of functions her body was struggling to maintain. The doctors spoke in careful medical terminology about traumatic brain injury and internal bleeding and the delicate surgery that had saved her life, but left her future uncertain. We took turns sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, whispering words we hoped she could hear. I spent every possible moment in that chair beside her bed, reading her favorite books aloud, playing music from her phone, telling her stories about the kids in my caseload, who reminded me of her fierce protective instincts. My parents and Michael visited regularly, but they seemed uncomfortable in the hospital environment, uncertain how to navigate the maze of military protocols and medical updates. They would stay for an hour or two, make awkward conversation with the nurses, and then retreat to the hotel to make phone calls about the store or arrangements back home. But I stayed. I learned the names of every doctor and nurse on her floor. I memorized the visiting hours and meal schedules, and the subtle signs that indicated good days versus difficult ones.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I became Natalie's advocate, asking questions when the medical team made their rounds, researching treatment options online, fighting for every resource and opportunity that might help her recovery. The nurses began to rely on me for updates about her condition, and the doctors included me in conversations about her care plan in ways they didn't with the rest of my family. 3 weeks into our stay in Germany, Natalie woke up. It was a gradual process, not the dramatic movie moment of sudden consciousness, but a slow emergence from the fog of medication and trauma. The first word she spoke was my name. Not mom or dad, or help or hurt, but Claire, whispered so softly I almost missed it. I leaned close to her bed, took her hand in both of mine, and told her she was safe, that she was going to be okay, that I wasn't going anywhere. The recovery process was longer and more complicated than any of us had anticipated. There were setbacks and small victories, days when Natalie seemed like herself again, and days when the injuries stole pieces of who she had been before. But gradually, steadily, she began to heal. The military arranged for her transfer to a rehabilitation facility in the United States, and eventually, she was cleared to return home to Millbrook for the final stages of her recovery. Those months at home were some of the most precious time Natalie and I ever shared. She stayed in my apartment in Columbus during the week, attending physical therapy and counseling sessions, and we would drive back to Millbrook on weekends to visit our parents. We developed new routines, new ways of being sisters that accommodated her changed needs, and my role as her primary support system. I learned to read the subtle signs that indicated she was having a difficult day, the strategies that helped when memories of the attack surfaced unexpectedly, the importance of maintaining hope, while acknowledging the reality of what she had lost. It was during one of those quiet evenings in my apartment, while we were watching old movies and sharing takeout Chinese food, that Natalie told me about the letters. She had been writing to the families of soldiers who had died during her deployments, she explained, personal notes that went beyond the official military notifications. She had also been documenting the humanitarian work her unit had done, the schools they had helped build, the communities they had supported. She wanted their stories to be remembered. She said wanted people back home to understand that military service was about more than combat, that it was about building bridges and protecting hope in places where hope was scarce. She showed me a folder filled with photographs and handwritten notes, testimonials from village elders and children's drawings that had been given to her unit as gifts. There were letters from families thanking her for the care packages her unit had distributed, reports about water purification systems they had helped install, documentation of medical clinics they had supported. It was a record of service that went far beyond what our family knew, evidence of the depth of her commitment to making a difference in the world. That night, as we sat surrounded by the physical evidence of her service, Natalie made me promise something. If anything ever happened to her, if her injuries worsened, or if she didn't make it through the recovery process, she wanted me to make sure these stories were told. She wanted the families she had written to, the communities she had served, to know that their sacrifices and their gratitude had mattered to her. She wanted people to understand that being a soldier meant carrying the responsibility of representing the best of what America could be, even in the most difficult circumstances. I promised her that night, holding her hand in my small living room, surrounded by the evidence of her courage and compassion, that I would honor her wishes. I had no idea then how soon I would be called upon to keep that promise, or how keeping it would reveal truths about my family that I had never suspected. Natalie's recovery progressed steadily through the winter and into the spring. She regained most of her physical strength and cognitive function, though she continued to deal with occasional headaches and memory issues that the doctors assured us were normal, given the severity of her initial injury. She began talking about her future, about possibly returning to limited duty or transitioning to a civilian career that would allow her to continue serving others. She was accepted into a graduate program in international relations, with plans to focus on post-conflict reconstruction and humanitarian aid. For the first time in months, she seemed excited about the possibilities ahead of her. The accident happened on a rainy Thursday morning in April. Natalie was driving to a follow-up appointment at the VA hospital in Columbus when a drunk driver ran a red light and struck her car at full speed. The impact was catastrophic, the kind of collision that leaves no room for hope or gradual recovery. She was pronounced dead at the scene, killed instantly by the same kind of random violence that she had survived in Afghanistan, only to find waiting for her on a quiet street corner in Ohio. The call came while I was in court, presenting a case for a 7-year-old girl, whose father had abandoned her, and whose mother was struggling with addiction. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, but I ignored it, focused on the testimony that would determine this child's future. It wasn't until the hearing was over, until I was walking back to my car in the courthouse parking lot, that I listened to the voicemail from my father. His voice was broken, barely recognizable, as he struggled to form the words that would change everything. I drove to the hospital on autopilot, my mind refusing to process what I had heard, my body moving through familiar motions, while my heart hammered against my ribs. I found my parents in the waiting room, holding each other and sobbing with a rawness that made my own grief feel small and selfish. Michael was there too, pacing the hallway, making phone calls about funeral arrangements and newspaper notices, handling the practical details, because someone had to, and because focusing on logistics was easier than facing the magnitude of what we had lost. But as the hours passed, as we moved through the terrible choreography of sudden death, I began to notice something that chilled me more than the grief itself. My family was already beginning to rewrite Natalie's story, already shaping the narrative that would define how she was remembered. They spoke about her military service in general terms, focusing on her courage and patriotism, rather than the specific work she had done, the communities she had served, the individual lives she had touched. They planned a funeral that would honor the soldier they wanted her to have been, rather than the complex, compassionate woman she actually was. When I tried to share some of the stories from her letters, when I mentioned the families she had written to, and the humanitarian projects she had supported, my parents nodded politely but quickly redirected the conversation back to safer topics. When I suggested contacting some of the military families she had corresponded with, to let them know about her death, and invite them to the funeral, my mother said it might be too complicated, too emotional for people who were already dealing with their own losses. It became clear to me that my family intended to mourn the Natalie they understood, the local girl who had served her country and come home changed, rather than the woman who had carried the weight of others' stories and dedicated herself to honoring their sacrifices. They weren't being malicious or deliberately dismissive, they simply couldn't comprehend the depth of her service, the personal connections she had forged, the promises she had made and kept. In their grief they were retreating to the familiar, the comfortable, the version of Natalie that fit into their understanding of what a soldier should be. That's when I realized I would be carrying the burden of her real story alone. That's when I understood that honoring her wishes, keeping the promise I had made in my living room, just a few months earlier, would require me to fight for the truth of who she had been, even if it meant standing against my own family's version of her legacy. That's when I began to prepare for a battle I never should have had to fight, a war over the memory of the sister I had loved, and lost and refused to let them diminish. The funeral was scheduled for the following Tuesday at St.
Andrew's Memorial Chapel, the same church where our family had celebrated baptisms and confirmations and wedding ceremonies for 3 generations. The obituary my parents wrote was beautiful and respectful, highlighting Natalie's service and sacrifice, but it read like the obituary of a stranger.
A generic tribute that could have been written for any soldier rather than the specific, irreplaceable woman who had filled my life with laughter and purpose and unconditional love. I spent the weekend before the funeral going through the folder of letters and photographs that Natalie had shown me, making copies of everything, researching the families and communities she had written about. I contacted her former commanding officer, a woman named Captain Brooks who had served alongside Natalie during both of her deployments. Captain Brooks remembered Natalie vividly, she told me, not just as a soldier but as someone who had gone above and beyond to connect with the people they were serving, to understand their stories and carry them back home. It was Captain Brooks who told me about the commendations Natalie had received for her humanitarian work, awards that had never been mentioned in any of the military communications my family had received. It was Captain Brooks who explained that Natalie had been recommended for recognition by several Afghan village leaders, who had written letters to her commanding officers praising her compassion and cultural sensitivity. It was Captain Brooks who helped me understand that my sister had been not just a good soldier but an exceptional one, someone whose service had been distinguished by her ability to see the humanity in every situation and respond with both strength and kindness. Armed with this new information, I approached my parents one more time, hoping to convince them to include some of these details in the funeral service, to invite Captain Brooks to speak about Natalie's humanitarian work, to create space for the fuller story of who she had been. But they were overwhelmed by their grief and exhausted by the logistics of planning a funeral on short notice. They had already finalized the program, they said, already confirmed the speakers and selected the music. Adding new elements would only complicate things, might confuse people who were expecting a traditional service, could potentially upset the careful balance they had worked to create. I understood their reasoning, even as it broke my heart. They were doing their best to honor Natalie's memory within the framework of their own understanding, trying to create a meaningful farewell that would bring comfort to the hundreds of people who would be attending. But I also knew that Natalie would have wanted her real story told, would have wanted the families she had served to know that their gratitude had been received and treasured, would have wanted her community to understand that service meant more than just wearing the uniform. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. If my family couldn't find room in their version of Natalie's story for the truth of who she had been, I would create that space myself. I would honor her wishes, keep my promise, and ensure that at least someone at her funeral understood the depth of her service and the breadth of her compassion. I called Captain Brooks back, explained the situation, and asked if there was any way to arrange for military representation that would reflect the full scope of Natalie's contributions. What Captain Brooks told me next left me speechless. The Army had already been planning to send an honor guard to Natalie's funeral, she explained, a detail that apparently hadn't been communicated to my family through the usual channels. But more than that, several of the families Natalie had written to, several of the communities she had served, had reached out to the military when they learned of her death. They wanted to send representatives, to be present at her funeral, to pay their respects to the soldier who had taken the time to see them as individuals rather than just part of a mission. The honor guard, Captain Brooks continued, had requested permission to perform a special ceremony, something beyond the standard military funeral protocols. They wanted to present Natalie's flag not just to our parents, as was traditional, but to the person who had been her closest companion and confidant, the family member who had supported her through her recovery and understood the depth of her commitment to service. They wanted to present the flag to me. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the Children's Services building, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what Captain Brooks was telling me. The military had planned a tribute that would honor the real Natalie, the woman who had served with both courage and compassion, who had built bridges between cultures and carried the stories of others with the same dedication she brought to every mission. And somehow, without my family's knowledge or involvement, they had identified me as the person who best understood and deserved to receive that honor. I could have told Captain Brooks about my family's plans, could have explained that they weren't expecting additional military participation, could have suggested that the traditional protocols might be more appropriate for our small-town community. But I didn't. Because I knew that this was what Natalie would have wanted, this was the promise I had made to her, this was my chance to ensure that her real story was told, even if no one else in my family was prepared to hear it. The morning of the funeral, I dressed carefully in the black dress I had worn to court hearings and important meetings, adding the small silver pin that Natalie had given me before her first deployment, a simple piece of jewelry that had become my talisman during the months of her recovery. I drove to St. Andrew's Memorial Chapel with my heart pounding, knowing that in a few hours, everything my family believed about Natalie's service, everything they thought they understood about her legacy, would be revealed as only part of a much larger, more complex, more beautiful story. As I pulled into the church parking lot, I saw the cars beginning to arrive, friends and family members, dressed in their funeral best, carrying flowers and tissues and the heavy weight of sudden loss. I saw my parents' car near the front entrance, my brother's family climbing out of their minivan, the careful choreography of a community gathering to say goodbye to someone they had loved and admired. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. None of them knew that in exactly 1 hour, their understanding of Natalie Donovan would be forever changed. I took a deep breath, checked my appearance in the rearview mirror, and stepped out into the cool autumn air. The wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain, the kind of weather that makes everything feel both beautiful and melancholy. I walked toward the chapel doors, past the gathering crowd of mourners, past my family members, who nodded at me with sad smiles, past the life I had known before this moment. Because in exactly 57 minutes, 10 members of the Army Honor Guard would march through those chapel doors. And when they did, when they carried Natalie's flag to me instead of to our parents, when they acknowledged the bond between sisters that had transcended military protocols and family hierarchies, everything would change. The sister they had forgotten would finally be remembered, and the soldier they thought they knew would be revealed in all her complex, compassionate, extraordinary glory. The chapel filled slowly, like water seeping into every corner of a vessel. I watched from my seat in the back row as hundreds of people filed through the heavy wooden doors, their faces etched with the particular solemnity that comes with unexpected loss. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the worn pews and polished floors. The air smelled of lilies and old wood, of the kind of permanence that makes temporary moments feel even more fragile. My parents sat in the front row, my mother's shoulders shaking with silent sobs, my father's arm wrapped around her with the protective stance of a man trying to hold his family together through sheer force of will. Michael and his wife occupied the seats beside them, their children fidgeting quietly, too young to fully understand what death meant, but old enough to sense the weight of adult grief surrounding them. The family section stretched for 3 rows, filled with aunts and uncles and cousins I hadn't seen since the last wedding or graduation, all of them dressed in their finest black clothes, all of them whispering condolences, and sharing memories of the Natalie they remembered. But as I sat there, invisible in my corner seat, listening to the murmured conversations that floated back to me on the chapel's acoustics, something cold began to settle in my chest. They were talking about Natalie as if she had been a different person entirely, as if the woman they were mourning bore only a passing resemblance to the sister I had known and loved. They spoke about her military service in vague terms, calling her a hero and a patriot without understanding what those words had meant to her specifically. They shared stories from her childhood and high school years, memories that stopped abruptly when she enlisted, as if the most significant chapter of her life had been too foreign for them to comprehend or remember. My Aunt Dorothy leaned across the aisle to whisper to my cousin Mark about how proud the family was of Natalie's service, but how difficult it had been when she was deployed, how they had all worried and prayed for her safe return. She spoke as if the family had been united in their support, as if they had all shared equally in the burden of loving someone in harm's way. She made no mention of the countless hours I had spent on video calls with Natalie, of the care packages I had organized and shipped, of the sleepless nights, when I was the only one awake in Millbrook, calculating time zones and wondering if my sister was safe. Behind me I could hear Mrs. Patterson from the hardware store, telling someone about the day Natalie had stopped by in her uniform before her first deployment, how beautiful she had looked, how the whole family had been so proud. She described a scene I remembered differently, a tense afternoon, when my parents had peppered Natalie with questions about whether she was sure about her decision, whether she had considered the impact on the family business, whether she understood what she was giving up. I had been the one to drive Natalie away from that conversation, the one to take her for coffee and listen as she processed their concerns and doubts. The funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Henderson, who had been handling Donovan family services for 2 decades, approached the podium to begin the ceremony. He spoke about Natalie with the careful dignity that comes from years of practice, painting her life in broad strokes that captured her essence without venturing into the specifics that might overwhelm the grieving. He mentioned her birth in Millbrook, her graduation from the local high school, her decision to serve her country, and her tragic death in the prime of her life. It was a beautiful tribute, respectful and appropriate, and it told the story of a woman I barely recognized. The first speaker was Michael, who walked to the podium with the steady composure of someone accustomed to public speaking, someone who had learned to represent the family business at Chamber of Commerce meetings and community events. He spoke about growing up with two little sisters, about his role as the protective older brother, about watching Natalie grow from a mischievous child into a responsible young woman. He shared funny stories about her stubbornness, her competitive streak in family board games, her habit of leaving muddy footprints through the house after playing in the backyard. His words were warm and loving, filled with genuine affection for the sister he had cherished. But they were also carefully constructed, designed to present a version of Natalie that fit comfortably within the family narrative he had been raised to protect. He spoke about her military service as an extension of her natural leadership abilities, her desire to serve something larger than herself, her commitment to protecting the freedoms that made their family business possible. He made it sound noble and abstract, a career choice that reflected well on the Donovan family values, without delving into the messy realities of what that service had actually entailed. When Michael mentioned me, it was in passing, a brief acknowledgement that Natalie had been especially close to her sister Claire, that the two of them had shared a special bond. He didn't elaborate on the nature of that bond, didn't mention the role I had played in supporting Natalie through her deployments and recovery, didn't acknowledge that I had been the primary constant in her life during the most challenging period she had ever faced. I was reduced to a footnote in my own sister's story, a minor character whose importance could be summarized in a single sentence. Next came my father, who rarely spoke in public, but had insisted on saying something about his youngest daughter. He walked to the podium slowly, his usually straight shoulders slightly hunched with grief, his hands shaking as he adjusted the microphone. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, barely controlled, each word carrying the weight of a man trying to process a loss that defied all logic and fairness. He talked about Natalie as his baby girl, the daughter who had surprised them later in life, who had brought joy and laughter into their home when they thought their family was complete. He described her childhood fearlessness, the way she had followed Michael and me everywhere, determined to keep up despite being the smallest and youngest. He spoke about the pride he had felt when she graduated from basic training, how he had never quite understood her decision to join the military, but had supported it because he trusted her judgment and knew she was capable of anything she set her mind to. But then his voice began to break, and the carefully constructed composure he had maintained throughout the week of funeral preparations started to crumble. He spoke about the phone calls from overseas, the worry that kept him awake at night, the relief when she returned home safely from her first deployment. He mentioned the accident that had nearly taken her life in Afghanistan, the terrifying weeks in the German hospital, the miracle of her recovery and return to Millbrook. What he didn't mention, what he couldn't seem to find words for, was the period that had followed her recovery. He spoke as if her story had ended happily with her homecoming, as if the months she had spent rebuilding her life, processing her trauma, and preparing for her future had been a simple return to normal, rather than the complex journey of healing and growth that I had witnessed firsthand. He described a homecoming that had lasted a few weeks rather than the year-long process of rehabilitation and readjustment that had actually taken place. His silence about that period felt like a deliberate erasure, not malicious, but simply limited by his own understanding of what her recovery had involved. He had seen the surface aspects of her healing, the physical therapy appointments and medical checkups, but he had missed the deeper work she had been doing, the way she had been processing her experiences, and planning for a future that would honor both her service and her desire to continue helping others. That work had happened primarily in my apartment, during our late-night conversations, through the connections she had maintained with military families and the humanitarian projects she had been planning to pursue. When my mother rose to speak, I felt my throat tighten with anticipation. Of all the family members, she had always been the most emotionally expressive, the one most likely to speak from the heart, rather than from a prepared script. I hoped that her grief might crack open the careful narrative my family had constructed, that her raw emotion might reveal some acknowledgement of who Natalie had really been during those final months of her life. She began by thanking everyone for coming, for the flowers and casseroles and kind words that had sustained the family through the darkest week of their lives. She spoke about Natalie as her youngest child, her unexpected blessing, the daughter who had filled their house with music and laughter and endless questions about how the world worked. She shared memories of bedtime stories and scraped knees, of dance recitals and science fair projects, of the ordinary moments that make up the extraordinary love between a mother and daughter.
When she reached Natalie's military service, her voice took on a tone I had heard before, a mixture of pride and bewilderment that had characterized her response to her daughter's career choice from the beginning. She spoke about receiving letters and phone calls from deployment, about the worry that never quite left her chest, about the prayers she had whispered every night for her daughter's safety. She described the relief of Natalie's return from her first tour, the joy of having her home for the holidays, the hope that maybe she would decide not to deploy again. But then she talked about the injury, and her voice broke completely. She described the phone call that had shattered their world, the frantic arrangements to fly to Germany, the terrifying uncertainty of those first few days when they didn't know if Natalie would survive. She spoke about sitting beside her daughter's hospital bed, holding her hand and whispering promises that everything would be okay, that the family would take care of her, that she never had to worry about anything ever again. What my mother described next made my chest tighten with a familiar ache. She talked about bringing Natalie home to Millbrook, about setting up the spare bedroom so she could recover surrounded by family, about the meals she had prepared, and the careful attention she had provided during those difficult first weeks. She spoke as if Natalie had spent her entire recovery period in the family home, as if the support and care had come primarily from our parents, as if the whole family had rallied together to nurse her back to health. The truth was more complicated and more painful. Natalie had spent exactly 3 weeks in my parents' house before asking me to take her to Columbus, where she could access better medical care and have more independence during her recovery. She had been grateful for our parents' love and concern, but she had also felt suffocated by their hovering attention, frustrated by their assumption that her injury had made her helpless, uncomfortable with their attempts to treat her like a child who needed protection from the world. I had been the one to help her find an apartment near mine, to drive her to physical therapy appointments, to sit with her during the counseling sessions that helped her process both her military trauma and her family dynamics. I had been the one to research adaptive equipment when her headaches made certain activities difficult, to help her navigate the bureaucracy of military disability benefits, to support her as she made decisions about her future that our parents couldn't understand or accept. But my mother's version of events erased all of that. In her telling, Natalie's recovery had been a family effort, a heartwarming story of a daughter coming home and a family rallying to care for her. She made no mention of the tension that had developed when Natalie had chosen to live independently, of the hurt feelings when she had relied more heavily on me than on our parents, of the confusion when she had begun making plans for graduate school rather than settling back into the comfortable routines of life in Millbrook. As my mother concluded her remarks, thanking everyone again for their love and support, I felt a deep chill settle in my bones. She had told a beautiful story about a beloved daughter, but it wasn't Natalie's story. It was the story they wished had been true, the version that fit comfortably within their understanding of family and duty and the proper order of things. In their narrative, Natalie had been a good daughter who had served her country admirably and then returned home to be cared for by her loving family until a tragic accident took her away too soon. The reality was that Natalie had been a complex, independent woman who had served her country with extraordinary compassion and dedication, who had survived a life-threatening injury and used that experience to deepen her commitment to helping others, who had spent the final year of her life building toward a future that would allow her to continue serving while also honoring the connections she had made with military families and Afghan communities. She had been planning to start graduate school in the fall, to pursue a career in international humanitarian work, to use her military experience and personal connections to build bridges between cultures and support post-conflict reconstruction efforts. None of that appeared in my family's version of her story. Their Natalie was a local girl who had done her duty and come home, rather than a woman who had found her calling and was preparing to dedicate her life to it. Their narrative was loving but limited, shaped by their own experiences and expectations, rather than by the reality of who Natalie had become and what she had been working toward. The next speaker was Natalie's high school principal, who had remained in touch with her over the years and had been following her military career with pride. He spoke about her academic achievements, her participation in student government, her natural leadership abilities that had made her stand out even in a small school where everyone knew everyone else. He shared an anecdote about her senior year, when she had organized a fundraiser for military families that had raised more money than any previous student initiative. His words were kind and respectful, but they focused entirely on the Natalie he had known before her military service, the teenager who had shown early signs of the leadership and compassion that would define her adult life. He made no reference to her actual military accomplishments, to the commendations she had received, to the specific ways her service had impacted the communities she had worked with. Like the others, he was describing a version of Natalie that ended where her real story had begun. I found myself thinking about the folder of letters and photographs that sat in my apartment, evidence of a life and a legacy that no one in this chapel seemed to know about or understand. I thought about the families in Afghanistan who had written to thank Natalie for her kindness during medical missions, about the children who had drawn pictures for her unit, about the village elders who had praised her cultural sensitivity in official communications with her commanding officers. I thought about the detailed reports she had written about humanitarian projects, the careful documentation of infrastructure improvements and educational initiatives that her unit had supported. All of that work, all of those connections, all of the evidence of her extraordinary service was invisible to the people gathered in St. Andrew's Memorial Chapel. They were mourning a woman they loved, but they were missing the fullness of who she had been, the depth of her commitment, the breadth of her impact. Their grief was real, and their love was genuine, but their understanding was incomplete. When the pastor rose to deliver the main eulogy, I hoped that perhaps he would have a different perspective, that his spiritual training might have given him insight into aspects of Natalie's character that had escaped the notice of her family members. Pastor Williams had known our family for years, had baptized both Natalie and me, had officiated at Michael's wedding, and countless other family milestones. If anyone was positioned to speak about the deeper dimensions of Natalie's life, it would be him. He began with a passage from Isaiah, about those who serve others, finding strength and renewal, about the importance of responding to God's call, even when it leads away from comfort and familiarity. It seemed promising, a framework that might acknowledge the spiritual dimensions of Natalie's military service, the way her faith had shaped her approach to helping others, and building connections across cultural boundaries. But as he continued, it became clear that his perspective was also limited by his distance from her actual experiences. He spoke about military service as a calling, about the sacrifice involved in leaving family to serve strangers, about the courage required to face danger in defense of others. His words were beautiful and meaningful, rooted in genuine theological understanding, but they remained abstract, focused on general principles rather than specific realities. He talked about Natalie's service as an example of Christian love in action, of putting the needs of others before personal comfort and safety. He described her deployment as a mission of peace, a way of carrying God's love to places where it was desperately needed. His framing was both accurate and inspiring, but it glossed over the complexity of military service, the moral ambiguities that Natalie had wrestled with, the specific ways she had tried to live out her faith, in circumstances that didn't always offer clear ethical choices. I remembered conversations Natalie and I had shared about the tension between her role as a soldier and her desire to help civilians, about the frustration of working within military constraints when she could see humanitarian needs that weren't being addressed, about the guilt she felt when her unit's presence sometimes created more problems than it solved for local communities. These weren't failures of faith or character, but the natural complexity of trying to serve others, in a context where good intentions didn't always translate into positive outcomes. Pastor Williams concluded his remarks with a prayer for comfort and healing, asking God to help the family find peace in their grief, and to honor Natalie's memory by continuing her legacy of service to others. It was a beautiful prayer, heartfelt and appropriate, but it felt hollow to me, because the legacy he was invoking bore so little resemblance to the actual work Natalie had been doing and planning to continue. As the service moved toward its conclusion, I felt the weight of all the unspoken truths pressing against my chest like a physical burden. The chapel was filled with people who loved Natalie, who genuinely wanted to honor her memory, but they were honoring a version of her that existed primarily in their own understanding, rather than in the reality of her lived experience. Their grief was valid, and their intentions were pure, but their knowledge was incomplete.
I thought about the promise I had made to Natalie in my apartment, the commitment I had accepted to ensure that her real story was told, that the families and communities she had served would know that their gratitude had been received and treasured. I thought about the military families she had corresponded with, who had learned of her death through official channels and wanted to pay their respects to a soldier who had seen them as individuals rather than statistics. I thought about the Afghan villagers who had written letters praising her compassion, whose words would never be heard in this chapel because my family didn't know they existed. Most of all, I thought about the honor guard that was assembling outside, preparing to enter this sacred space and perform a ceremony that would acknowledge the fullness of Natalie's service in ways that none of the speakers had been able to do. In a few minutes, 10 soldiers would march through those doors carrying the flag that had draped my sister's casket, and they would present it not to my parents, as tradition dictated, but to me, in recognition of the bond that had sustained Natalie through her most challenging period and the promise I had made to preserve her legacy. The congregation began to stir as the service moved toward its final moments, people reaching for tissues and preparing for the recessional that would mark the end of the formal ceremony. My family sat in their front row seats, composed and dignified in their grief, surrounded by the community that had known and loved them for generations. They had no idea that their understanding of Natalie's life was about to be challenged, that their carefully constructed narrative was about to be complicated by evidence of a service and sacrifice they had never fully comprehended. I checked my watch and calculated that the honor guard would be entering in approximately 4 minutes. My heart began to race, not with nervousness but with anticipation, with the knowledge that justice was finally about to be served, that truth was about to break through the well-intentioned but limited perspective that had dominated this entire ceremony. Natalie's real story was about to be told, whether my family was ready to hear it or not. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the chapel windows and sending fallen leaves skittering across the parking lot. The sound created a subtle backdrop to the closing hymn, a reminder of the world beyond these walls, of the larger story that connected this small-town funeral to military bases and Afghan villages and all the places where Natalie's service had left its mark. In 4 minutes, that larger story would enter St. Andrew's Memorial Chapel, and nothing would ever be the same. The final hymn was ending when I heard it. A sound so faint that most of the congregation missed it entirely, but unmistakable to anyone who had spent time around military ceremonies. The rhythmic cadence of polished boots striking pavement in perfect unison, growing stronger with each measured step. The sound filtered through the chapel's thick stone walls like a distant drumbeat, precise and purposeful, carrying with it the weight of tradition and honor that had been shaped by centuries of military protocol. I felt my pulse quicken as the footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by the subtle rustle of ceremonial uniforms and the quiet jingle of dress medals moving in formation. The congregation was still focused on Pastor Williams as he offered the closing benediction, their heads bowed in prayer, unaware that the most significant moment of the entire service was approaching from outside. My parents remained seated in the front row, my mother clutching a damp tissue, my father's arms still wrapped protectively around her shoulders, both of them lost in their private grief and completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. The chapel doors, heavy oak panels that had witnessed 3 generations of Donovan family celebrations and sorrows, began to swing open with a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to carry its own gravity. The late morning light streamed in from outside, creating a dramatic silhouette that framed the entrance like a stage, and then they appeared. 10 members of the United States Army Honor Guard entered St. Andrew's Memorial Chapel in perfect formation, their movements synchronized with the precision that comes from countless hours of practice and an unwavering commitment to excellence. They wore their dress blue uniforms with crisp perfection, every button polished, every crease sharp enough to cut glass, every detail reflecting the highest standards of military bearing. Their white gloves caught the light from the stained glass windows as they marched, and the ribbons on their chests told stories of service and sacrifice that stretched across continents and decades. At the head of the formation walked Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a career soldier whose posture spoke of battles fought and won, of promises kept and duties fulfilled. Behind him came 9 other soldiers, each carrying themselves with the dignity and solemnity that befitted the sacred duty they were performing. They moved as one unit, their steps perfectly timed, their faces set in expressions of respectful concentration that acknowledged both the gravity of death and the honor of military service. The congregation turned as one, hundreds of heads swiveling toward the entrance, conversations dying mid-sentence as the reality of what they were witnessing began to sink in. I heard gasps and whispers, the rustling of fabric as people shifted in their seats to get a better view, the sharp intake of breath that comes when something unexpected and profound interrupts the familiar patterns of daily life. My family remained frozen in their front row seats, their faces reflecting confusion and surprise as they tried to process what was happening. The honor guard moved down the center aisle with measured steps, their formation never wavering, despite the narrow space between the pews and the curious stares of the mourners. They passed row after row of upturned faces, past neighbors and relatives and business associates who had known the Donovan family for years but had never witnessed anything quite like this. The soldiers' presence transformed the atmosphere of the chapel, from intimate grief to something larger and more formal, a recognition that Natalie's death carried significance beyond the boundaries of Millbrook, Ohio. Behind the formation came two figures that made my breath catch in my throat. Captain Brooks walked with the measured gait of an officer accustomed to ceremony, her uniform bearing the insignia and ribbons that marked her as someone who had served with distinction in some of the most challenging environments the military had to offer. Beside her was a man I didn't recognize, an older soldier whose chest displayed rows of decorations that spoke of a career spent in service to others, of missions completed and responsibilities shouldered across multiple decades. But it was what Captain Brooks carried that made tears spring to my eyes despite my determination to remain composed. In her white-gloved hands was a thick manila folder, the same type of folder that Natalie had shown me in my apartment months earlier, filled with letters and photographs and documentation of service that went far beyond what appeared in any official record. This folder, however, was different. It was thicker, more comprehensive, bearing the official seals and signatures that transformed personal correspondence into historical record. The honor guard reached the front of the chapel and executed a precise halt, their formation now standing at attention before the altar where Natalie's flag-draped casket rested beneath its cascade of white lilies. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that comes not from the absence of sound, but from the presence of something so significant that even breathing seems inadequate to the moment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, removed his cap with practiced precision, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through every corner of the chapel without the aid of amplification. His words were formal yet personal, adhering to military protocol while acknowledging the unique circumstances that had brought them to this small-town church on this autumn morning. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and respectful, "we are here today to honor the service and sacrifice of Specialist Natalie Donovan, United States Army National Guard, who gave her life in service to her country and to the communities she served with distinction during 2 deployments to Afghanistan." The words hung in the air like a revelation, simple facts that somehow contained depths of meaning my family had never fully grasped. I watched my parents' faces as they processed what they were hearing, saw the confusion in their eyes as they tried to reconcile this formal military recognition with their understanding of their daughter's service. My father's brow furrowed with the effort of comprehension, while my mother's grip on her tissue tightened, as if she were trying to anchor herself to something familiar in a moment that had suddenly become foreign and overwhelming. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez continued, his words carefully chosen to honor both military tradition and the specific circumstances of Natalie's service. Specialist Donovan distinguished herself through her compassionate service to civilian populations in Afghanistan, her dedication to building bridges between military personnel and local communities, and her commitment to ensuring that the voices of those she served were heard and honored by her fellow soldiers and her family back home. Each phrase landed like a small explosion in the carefully constructed narrative my family had built around Natalie's military career. They had spoken of her service in general terms, focusing on her courage and patriotism, while remaining vague about the specifics of what she had actually done during her deployments. But Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was describing something much more concrete and complex, a pattern of service that had gone beyond standard military duties to encompass the kind of humanitarian work that required both professional skill and personal courage. During her first deployment, he continued, Specialist Donovan volunteered for medical missions that brought aid to remote villages, often under dangerous conditions. She learned basic phrases in Dari and Pashto in order to communicate more effectively with local civilians, and she developed relationships with village elders and community leaders that proved invaluable to her unit's success in building trust and cooperation. I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of pride and sorrow as I listened to this official recognition of work that Natalie had described to me in our late-night phone calls but had never shared with our parents in detail. She had told me about the children who gathered around their medical tent, about the elderly women who had initially been suspicious of foreign soldiers, but gradually came to trust her gentle manner and genuine concern for their welfare. She had described the painstaking process of learning enough local language to ask about symptoms and offer comfort, the way small gestures of respect and cultural sensitivity could transform hostile encounters into opportunities for connection. But my parents had never heard these stories. Their understanding of Natalie's deployment had been filtered through official communications and brief, sanitized phone calls that focused on reassuring them of her safety rather than educating them about the complexity of her work. They had worried about her physical danger while remaining largely unaware of the emotional and cultural challenges she faced every day. The delicate balance required to serve as both a soldier and a humanitarian worker, in a context where those roles sometimes conflicted. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez paused for a moment, allowing his words to settle before continuing with the next phase of his presentation. During her second deployment, Specialist Donovan took on additional responsibilities related to documenting the humanitarian impact of her unit's work. She maintained correspondence with families of fallen soldiers, not as an official duty, but as a personal commitment to ensuring that their sacrifices were recognized and remembered. The mention of Natalie's letter-writing project sent a chill through me, partly because of my own intimate knowledge of that work, and partly because of the expression on my family's faces as they heard about it for the first time. My mother's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hurt, the realization that her daughter had been carrying on extensive correspondence that had never been mentioned during their regular phone calls. My father's jaw tightened with what I recognized as his typical response to information that challenged his understanding of a situation he thought he had under control. These letters, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez continued, were not merely condolence messages, but detailed accounts of the ways fallen soldiers had impacted the communities they served, the specific projects they had worked on, and the relationships they had built with local civilians. Specialist Donovan understood that military families needed to know that their loved ones' sacrifices had meaning beyond abstract concepts of duty and honor, that their service had created tangible improvements in the lives of real people. As he spoke, Captain Brooks stepped forward and opened the manila folder she had been carrying, revealing page after page of documentation that represented months of careful compilation and official verification. I could see photocopies of handwritten letters, typed reports with military letterhead, photographs of infrastructure projects and medical missions, testimonials from Afghan civilians, translated into English by official interpreters. It was a comprehensive record of service that went far beyond anything my family had imagined, evidence of impact that had been systematically documented and preserved. In addition to her correspondence with military families, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez continued. Specialist Donovan documented the humanitarian projects undertaken by her unit, creating detailed reports about water purification systems, medical clinics, and educational initiatives that were supported by American military personnel working in cooperation with local communities. These reports were used by her commanding officers to demonstrate the effectiveness of humanitarian engagement and to secure continued support for community-based projects. The scope of what he was describing began to sink in for the congregation, and I could feel the atmosphere in the chapel shifting as people realized they were learning about aspects of Natalie's service that had never been mentioned in any of the earlier tributes. This wasn't simply a young woman who had served her country with courage and dedication. This was someone who had used her military position to create systematic change, to build lasting relationships, to ensure that the American military presence in Afghanistan contributed something positive and enduring to the communities where they were stationed. My brother Michael was leaning forward in his seat, his expression reflecting the kind of intense concentration he usually reserved for complex business problems. I could see him trying to reconcile this detailed account of Natalie's work with his earlier tribute that had focused on her childhood personality and general leadership qualities. The woman Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was describing bore some resemblance to the sister Michael remembered, but she was also someone more sophisticated and capable than any of us had fully understood. Following her injury in Afghanistan, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez continued. Specialist Donovan continued her correspondence and documentation work during her recovery period, maintaining contact with the families and communities she had served, despite her own physical and emotional challenges. She also began developing plans for post-military service that would allow her to continue her humanitarian work in a civilian capacity. This was the information that hit closest to home for me, the acknowledgement of work I had witnessed firsthand during the months when Natalie had lived in Columbus during her recovery. I had seen her sitting at my kitchen table, night after night, carefully crafting letters to military families, researching graduate programs in international relations, developing proposals for nonprofit organizations that specialized in post-conflict reconstruction. But I had assumed this was private work, personal healing that helped her process her own experiences, rather than professional preparation that had been recognized and supported by her military superiors. The revelation that her commanding officers had been aware of and supportive of her post-military plans added another layer to my understanding of how thoroughly my family had misunderstood the trajectory of her life.
They had seen her recovery period as a temporary setback, followed by an expected return to normal civilian life, possibly in Millbrook, possibly in a career that would complement the family business, or at least remain within the boundaries of their geographic and cultural comfort zone. They had never grasped that she was preparing for a future that would take her far from Ohio, into a world of international humanitarian work that would build directly on her military experience. Captain Brooks stepped forward at this point, her presence adding weight to the ceremony, as she prepared to deliver information that would be even more surprising to my family. She spoke with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to briefing senior officers and foreign dignitaries, her voice carrying the confidence that comes from years of experience in complex international environments. The documentation that Specialist Donovan compiled during her service, Captain Brooks announced, has been reviewed by the Department of Defense and found to be of exceptional value for understanding the humanitarian impact of military engagement in Afghanistan. Her reports and correspondence have been used to develop best practices for future military humanitarian missions and to train soldiers preparing for deployment in similar environments. The words fell into the chapel like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread through the congregation in visible waves. People began to whisper to each other, processing the implications of what they were hearing. Natalie hadn't simply been a local girl who had served her country. She had been someone whose work was being studied and replicated, whose insights were shaping military policy and training programs across the entire Department of Defense. My parents looked as if they had been physically struck by this information. My mother's face had gone pale, and she was staring at Captain Brooks with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if the woman was speaking in a foreign language that required translation. My father's hands were clenched in his lap, his knuckles white with the tension of trying to absorb facts that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his daughter's military career. Furthermore, Captain Brooks continued, several of the Afghan communities that Specialist Donovan worked with have submitted formal requests to the United States military, asking that her family be informed of the lasting impact of her service on their villages. Village elders, medical personnel, and community leaders have written letters expressing their gratitude for her cultural sensitivity, her dedication to understanding their needs, and her commitment to ensuring that American military aid was distributed fairly and effectively. She reached into the folder and withdrew a small stack of papers that had been translated and notarized, official documents that represented voices from halfway around the world, speaking directly to the family that had gathered in this Ohio chapel. These letters have been translated by certified interpreters and verified by military intelligence personnel. They represent the testimony of people whose lives were directly impacted by Specialist Donovan's service, people who wanted her family to understand that her work had meaning and value that extended far beyond her military duties. The existence of these letters was perhaps the most shocking revelation of all, evidence that Natalie had built relationships and made impacts that had survived her departure and continued to resonate in communities. These weren't abstract commendations from military bureaucrats, but personal testimonies from civilians who had known Natalie as an individual, who had worked with her on specific projects, who had been touched by her kindness and professionalism in ways that had left lasting impressions. As Captain Brooks prepared to read excerpts from these letters, I felt the weight of the promise I had made to Natalie settling more heavily on my shoulders. This was what she had wanted her family to understand. This was the legacy she had been afraid would be forgotten or misrepresented. She had known that her service involved more than her family could comprehend from their perspective in Millbrook, and she had wanted someone to ensure that the full story was preserved and honored. The first letter, Captain Brooks announced, comes from Dr. Rashid Ahmed, the director of a medical clinic in Kandahar province that was supported by Specialist Donovan's unit during her second deployment. She unfolded the translated document and began to read in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the chapel. To the family of Specialist Natalie Donovan, we wish to express our deepest condolences for your loss and our profound gratitude for the service of your daughter. Specialist Donovan worked with our clinic for 7 months, helping to distribute medical supplies, assisting with patient intake, and serving as a liaison between our staff and American military personnel. She learned basic medical terminology in Dari so that she could communicate more effectively with our patients, and she spent her off-duty hours helping our nurses organize medical records and inventory supplies. The letter continued with specific details about projects Natalie had worked on, improvements she had suggested to clinic operations, and relationships she had built with both medical staff and patients. Ahmed described her as someone who had understood that effective humanitarian work required patience, cultural sensitivity, and a genuine commitment to serving others, rather than simply following orders or completing assigned duties. Most importantly, the letter concluded, Specialist Donovan treated our patients and staff with dignity and respect, never making us feel like recipients of charity, but rather like partners in important work. She understood that our clinic existed before American soldiers arrived, and would continue to exist after they left, and she worked to strengthen our capabilities, rather than creating dependency on external support. We will remember her kindness and professionalism for many years to come. As Captain Brooks finished reading, I watched my mother's face crumple with an emotion that was more complex than simple grief. She was crying not just for the daughter she had lost, but for the woman she was only now beginning to understand, the person who had been living a life of service and impact that extended far beyond anything her family had imagined. The gap between the Natalie they thought they knew, and the Natalie who was being revealed through these official testimonies, was so vast that it required a complete recalibration of their understanding of who she had been, and what her life had meant. The second letter came from a village elder, whose community had received assistance with a water purification project that Natalie's unit had supported. His words, filtered through translation, but still carrying the weight of genuine gratitude, described a young American soldier, who had taken the time to learn about local customs and concerns, who had listened carefully to community needs before proposing solutions, and who had worked to ensure that infrastructure improvements were sustainable and appropriate to local conditions. Each letter that Captain Brooks read added another layer to the picture of Natalie's service, revealing someone who had approached her military duties with a level of cultural awareness and humanitarian commitment that went far beyond what was required or expected. These weren't generic testimonials about American military aid, but specific accounts of personal relationships and individual acts of kindness that had made lasting impressions on people living in circumstances my family could barely imagine. The final letter came from the mother of an Afghan child, who had been treated at the clinic where Natalie had volunteered. The woman described how Natalie had sat with her daughter during a lengthy medical procedure, offering comfort and distraction, even though they shared no common language beyond gestures and facial expressions. She wrote about the small toys and pictures that Natalie had brought from America to give to children at the clinic, and about the way she had always remembered the names of patients and asked about their recovery during subsequent visits. Your daughter helped my child feel safe during a frightening time, the letter concluded. She showed us that American soldiers could be kind and gentle, not just strong and brave. We pray that Allah will comfort your hearts, as Specialist Donovan comforted ours during our time of need. As the last words of the letter echoed through the chapel, the silence that followed was profound and transformative. The congregation sat in stunned quiet, processing the implications of what they had heard, trying to reconcile the little girl they thought they had known with the internationally recognized humanitarian worker who had been revealed through these official testimonies. My family remained frozen in their front row seats, their faces reflecting a mixture of grief, pride, confusion, and something that might have been regret for opportunities missed and questions never asked. But the ceremony was not over. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward once again, his expression solemn, as he prepared to deliver the final and most significant element of the Honor Guard's presentation. In his hands was the flag that had covered Natalie's casket, folded with the precision that comes from thousands of practice sessions and countless previous ceremonies. The stars and stripes had been arranged in the traditional triangle that reduced the entire symbol of American democracy to a compact, meaningful package that could be presented to surviving family members as a tangible reminder of service and sacrifice. The United States Army, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez announced, would like to present this flag to the family member who best understood and supported Specialist Donovan's service, who maintained correspondence with her during her deployments, who assisted with her recovery following her injury, and who has committed to preserving and honoring the legacy of her humanitarian work. He turned away from my parents, away from Michael and his family, away from the front row, where tradition dictated that such presentations should be made. Instead, he looked directly at me, sitting alone in my back corner seat, invisible to most of the congregation, but clearly visible to the military personnel who had planned this ceremony, with careful attention to the reality of Natalie's relationships, rather than the assumptions of her family. Miss Claire Donovan, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chapel, on behalf of a grateful nation, and in recognition of your sister's exceptional service to military families and Afghan communities, we present you with this flag, and ask that you continue to honor her memory by ensuring that her story is told and her legacy preserved. The moment those words left his lips, the world seemed to stop. Every head in the chapel turned toward me. Hundreds of eyes suddenly focused on the sister who had been forgotten throughout the entire service. The woman who had been mentioned only in passing by previous speakers, the family member, who had somehow become the recipient of the military's highest honor for surviving relatives. My parents' faces reflected shock, confusion, and the beginning of understanding that their perception of family dynamics had been incomplete. I rose from my seat slowly, my legs trembling with the magnitude of what was happening, and began to walk down the center aisle toward the front of the chapel. The honor guard members stood at attention as I approached their formation, creating a corridor of respect and recognition that acknowledged both Natalie's service and my role in supporting and preserving it. Behind me, I could hear whispers and murmurs as the congregation tried to process what they were witnessing, the dramatic revision of family hierarchy that was being enacted through military protocol.
As I reached the front of the chapel, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez extended the folded flag toward me with white-gloved hands, his eyes meeting mine with an expression of solemn respect. I accepted the flag with both hands, feeling the weight of fabric and meaning, the culmination of promises made and kept, of service rendered and recognition received. The flag was warm from the chapel's heating system, and heavy with the significance of everything it represented. In that moment, standing before the altar with Natalie's flag in my hands and 10 members of the Army Honor Guard at attention around me, I felt the full weight of vindication settling into my bones. Not the bitter satisfaction of proving others wrong, but the deeper peace that comes from being seen and acknowledged, from having the truth recognized even when it contradicts comfortable assumptions and familiar narratives. The chapel remained silent as I stood there holding the flag, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. My family's understanding of Natalie's life and service had been fundamentally challenged. Their assumptions about family relationships and military protocol had been overturned, and their perception of my role in their daughter's and sister's life had been completely revised. The woman they had forgotten throughout the funeral service had been identified by the United States Army as the family member most deserving of their highest honor, the person who had best understood and supported Natalie's service to her country and to the world. But even as I savored this moment of recognition, I knew that the real work was just beginning. The flag in my hands represented not just acknowledgement of past service but responsibility for future action. I had been entrusted with preserving Natalie's legacy, with ensuring that her story was told completely and accurately, with maintaining the connections she had built with military families and Afghan communities. The Honor Guard's presentation had vindicated my relationship with my sister, but it had also committed me to a lifetime of service to her memory and the causes she had championed. As I turned to face the congregation, still holding the flag against my chest, I saw my parents' faces clearly for the first time since the ceremony had begun. Their expressions reflected a complex mixture of emotions that would take time to sort through and understand. There was grief for the daughter they had lost, pride in the recognition she had received, confusion about the aspects of her life they had never known, and perhaps the beginning of regret for the opportunities they had missed to truly see and understand the woman she had become. The truth had been revealed, the hidden depths of Natalie's service had been acknowledged, and the sister they had forgotten had been honored by the very institution that had shaped and defined the most meaningful chapter of Natalie's life. The vindication was complete, but the real story of what it all meant was just beginning to unfold. The silence that followed the flag presentation stretched across St. Andrew's Memorial Chapel like a held breath, thick with shock and the weight of revelations that had fundamentally altered everyone's understanding of the woman they had gathered to mourn. I stood at the front of the church, the folded flag pressed against my chest, feeling the eyes of 300 people boring into my back as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. The honor guard remained at attention around me, their presence both protective and validating, a living testament to the truth that had been hidden beneath my family's well-intentioned but incomplete narrative. My mother was the first to break the stunned quiet, her voice emerging as a whispered question that carried clearly through the chapel's acoustics despite its softness. "I don't understand," she said, her words directed towards Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, but her eyes fixed on me with an expression of bewilderment that bordered on betrayal. "Why wasn't the flag given to Robert and me? We're her parents. We're the ones who raised her, who worried about her, who loved her." The pain in her voice was genuine and heartbreaking, the cry of a mother who felt that her grief had been somehow diminished or invalidated by the military's decision to honor a different family member. She wasn't angry, not yet, just confused and hurt by what felt like a rejection of her maternal bond with Natalie, a suggestion that someone else had been more important to her daughter than the woman who had given birth to her and shaped her earliest years. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez maintained his military bearing as he responded, his voice respectful but unwavering in its commitment to the decision that had been made. Ma'am, with all due respect, the presentation of the flag follows specific protocols based on the service member's own wishes and the assessment of military personnel who worked closely with Specialist Donovan during her deployments and recovery. The decision was made after careful consideration of who had the deepest understanding of her service and the strongest commitment to preserving her legacy. His words were diplomatically phrased, but devastatingly clear in their implications. The military had evaluated my family's relationships with Natalie and determined that I, not our parents, was the person best positioned to honor her memory and continue her work. They had looked beyond traditional family hierarchies and conventional assumptions to identify the connection that had actually sustained Natalie through her most challenging period, the relationship that had been built on shared understanding rather than simply shared blood. My father rose from his seat slowly, his face flushed with the kind of controlled anger that had always been his response to situations that challenged his authority or questioned his understanding of how things should work. He was a man accustomed to being the head of his household, the final decision-maker in family matters, the person others turned to for guidance and leadership. The idea that military personnel had assessed his family dynamics and found his relationship with his daughter wanting was clearly more than he could easily accept. "Now wait just a minute," he said, his voice carrying the tone he used when dealing with difficult customers at the hardware store, firm but trying to remain reasonable. "I appreciate what the military is trying to do here, but Claire is just Natalie's sister. We're her parents. We're the ones who have the right to receive honors on her behalf. We're the ones who will be making decisions about her burial and her estate and her memory." The word just hung in the air like a slap, reducing my relationship with Natalie to something incidental, something less significant than the biological connections that had never translated into the kind of understanding and support that her military service had required. My father wasn't being deliberately cruel, but his dismissal of my bond with Natalie revealed how completely he had missed the depth of our connection, how thoroughly he had failed to comprehend the role I had played in sustaining her through her deployments and recovery. Captain Brooks stepped forward at this point, her presence adding weight to the military's position as she prepared to address my father's challenge with the authority of someone who had actually served alongside Natalie and witnessed our relationship firsthand. Her voice carried the crisp confidence of an officer, accustomed to dealing with difficult situations and complicated family dynamics, someone who had learned to navigate between military protocols and civilian expectations with diplomatic skill. "Sir," she began, her tone respectful but uncompromising, "I served with your daughter during both of her deployments, and I was her commanding officer during her recovery period. I can assure you that the decision to present the flag to Miss Claire Donovan was not made lightly or without careful consideration of the family dynamics involved." She paused for a moment, allowing her credentials to settle before continuing with information that would be even more difficult for my parents to hear. During Specialist Donovan's time in Afghanistan, she designated Claire as her primary emergency contact, not because she didn't love and respect you, but because Claire was the family member who best understood the realities of her service and could provide the kind of support she needed during difficult periods. The revelation that Natalie had formally designated me as her emergency contact hit my parents like a physical blow, their faces reflecting the hurt and confusion of people discovering that their daughter had made official decisions that excluded them from their expected role. My mother's hand flew to her throat as if she were having trouble breathing, while my father's jaw clenched with the effort of controlling his reaction to information that contradicted his understanding of family loyalty and natural hierarchy. Furthermore, Captain Brooks continued, "Claire was the family member who maintained regular correspondence with Specialist Donovan during her deployments, who visited her most frequently during her recovery in Germany, and who provided the primary support system during her rehabilitation period in the United States. She was also the person Specialist Donovan trusted with her documentation of humanitarian work and her plans for post-military service." Each fact that Captain Brooks presented was like another nail in the coffin of my parents' version of their relationship with Natalie, evidence that their daughter had built her primary support system around me, rather than around the family members they would have expected her to rely on. These weren't matters of opinion or interpretation, but documented realities that had been observed and recorded by military personnel who had no reason to favor one family member over another. My brother Michael stood up abruptly, his face reflecting the kind of frustrated anger that came from being confronted with information that challenged his sense of order and control. As the eldest child and heir to the family business, he was accustomed to being included in important decisions and consulted about family matters. The idea that major aspects of Natalie's life had been conducted without his knowledge or involvement was clearly difficult for him to accept. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising with emotion despite his usual careful self-control. "Claire lives in Columbus and works with social services. She doesn't know anything about military matters or international affairs. How could she possibly be better equipped to handle Natalie's legacy than her own family?" His question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had plagued my family's relationship with Natalie throughout her military career, the assumption that geographical proximity and shared last names were more important than actual knowledge and emotional connection. Michael couldn't comprehend that my work with vulnerable populations had actually prepared me well for understanding the complexities of Natalie's humanitarian service, that my experience with trauma and recovery had equipped me to support her through her own healing process. Captain Brooks addressed Michael's challenge with the patience of someone who had dealt with similar misconceptions many times before, her response designed to educate rather than simply refute. "Sir, Miss Donovan's background in social work and her experience with trauma recovery actually made her uniquely qualified to understand and support Specialist Donovan's service. She was familiar with the psychological challenges that come with serving vulnerable populations, and she understood the importance of maintaining connections with the communities that had been served." She reached into her folder and withdrew another document, this one bearing the letterhead of the Department of Veterans Affairs. In fact, Specialist Donovan had begun working with Miss Donovan to develop a proposal for a nonprofit organization that would continue her humanitarian work in a civilian capacity. The proposal had been reviewed and preliminarily approved by the VA's Community Outreach Division, with Miss Donovan designated as the primary coordinator and administrator. This was information that was completely new to me, evidence that Natalie had been making plans that extended our collaboration beyond her immediate recovery period into a long-term partnership that would allow her humanitarian work to continue indefinitely. The fact that she had been working with government agencies to formalize these plans, that she had designated me as her partner and successor without ever mentioning these developments to our parents, spoke to a level of trust and shared vision that went far beyond anything my family had imagined. The congregation, which had been listening to this exchange with the fascination that comes from witnessing private family drama played out in public, began to murmur among themselves as they processed the implications of what they were hearing. Mrs. Patterson from the hardware store leaned toward her husband and whispered something that made him shake his head in amazement. My Aunt Dorothy pressed her hand to her chest as if she were having difficulty breathing, her expression reflecting the shock of discovering that her understanding of family relationships had been completely incorrect. My mother stood up slowly, her movements unsteady as she struggled to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about her youngest daughter's life and priorities. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the chapel's acoustics, reaching every corner of the sacred space where her family's private dynamics were being exposed and examined. "Natalie never told us about any of this," she said, her words carrying the weight of maternal hurt and confusion. "She never mentioned emergency contacts or nonprofit organizations or special relationships with military personnel. She called us every week during her deployments. She came home for holidays. She seemed happy to see us. Why would she hide all of this from her own family?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, not directed at any specific person but at the situation itself, at the reality that had been revealed through the honor guard's presentation. My mother wasn't angry at me personally, but she was struggling to understand how such a fundamental disconnect could have developed between her perception of her relationship with Natalie and the reality of how Natalie had actually been living her life. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward to address her question, his response careful and diplomatic but honest about the challenges that often developed between military personnel and their civilian families. "Ma'am, in my experience, service members often compartmentalize their military and civilian lives, especially when their families have difficulty understanding or accepting the realities of military service. They love their families deeply, but they may rely more heavily on people who share their experiences and understand their challenges.
His explanation was gentle but devastating in its implications, suggesting that Natalie had maintained loving relationships with our parents, while building her primary support system elsewhere, that she had protected them from the full reality of her service, while trusting me with the deeper truths of her experience. She hadn't been deliberately deceptive, but she had been selectively honest, sharing different aspects of her life with different people based on their ability to understand and support her. Specialist Donovan spoke about her family with great love and affection. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez continued, but she also expressed concern that you might worry unnecessarily if you fully understood the scope of her humanitarian work or the extent of her involvement with military families and Afghan communities. She wanted to protect you from anxiety while also ensuring that someone in her family understood and could continue her work if necessary. The revelation that Natalie had been protecting our parents from worry while simultaneously preparing me to carry on her legacy created a complex emotional dynamic that was difficult for anyone to process. She had been motivated by love for our entire family, but she had also been pragmatic about the different roles we could play in supporting her service and preserving her work. Her decisions hadn't been about favoritism or rejection, but about matching responsibilities to capabilities and ensuring that her humanitarian efforts would survive beyond her own service. My father, who had been listening to these explanations with growing frustration, finally exploded with the kind of anger that comes from feeling excluded and diminished. "This is our daughter we're talking about," he said, his voice echoing through the chapel with surprising force. "Not some stranger, not some military project, but our child. We raised her, we loved her, we supported her decisions even when we didn't understand them. How dare you people come into our town, into our church, and tell us that we weren't good enough parents, that we didn't deserve to receive honors for our own daughter's service." His outburst revealed the deep hurt that lay beneath his confusion and anger, the fear that his parental bond with Natalie was being invalidated or diminished by the military's recognition of my relationship with her. He wasn't fighting against me personally, but against the implication that his love and concern for his daughter had been somehow inadequate or insufficient, that despite his best intentions and genuine affection, he had failed to provide the kind of support that Natalie had actually needed. Captain Brooks maintained her composure in the face of my father's anger, her response reflecting both empathy for his pain and commitment to the truth that needed to be acknowledged. "Sir, no one is questioning your love for your daughter or suggesting that you weren't good parents. But love and understanding are not always the same thing, and supporting a service member's career often requires knowledge and experience that civilian families may not possess through no fault of their own." She paused to let her words settle before continuing with information that would be even more difficult for my father to hear. Specialist Donovan made very specific requests about how she wanted her service to be remembered and her work to be continued. Those requests were documented in official military paperwork and witnessed by multiple officers. Our responsibility is to honor her wishes, regardless of how they might differ from traditional family expectations. The mention of documented wishes that had been unknown to my parents created another layer of shock and hurt, evidence that Natalie had been making formal plans about her legacy without consulting or even informing the people who had raised her. This wasn't simply a matter of military protocol or professional relationships, but a deliberate choice on Natalie's part to entrust her most important concerns to me rather than to our parents. I had been standing silently throughout this exchange, holding the flag and trying to process the magnitude of what was being revealed not just to my family but to the entire community. The Honor Guard's presentation had been intended to recognize my relationship with Natalie, but it had also exposed the limitations of my family's understanding in ways that were painful for everyone involved. I found myself in the strange position of being vindicated and heartbroken simultaneously, honored for my bond with my sister while watching my parents grapple with the realization that their relationship with her had been more complicated than they had understood. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet but clear, carrying through the chapel with the kind of calm authority that comes from knowing you are speaking the truth, regardless of how difficult that truth might be for others to hear. "Natalie loved all of us," I said, my words directed toward my parents, but intended for the entire congregation. "She never wanted to hurt anyone or make anyone feel excluded. But she also knew that her military service involved experiences and responsibilities that were difficult for people to understand if they hadn't lived through similar challenges." I took a deep breath before continuing, knowing that my next words would be crucial in determining how this confrontation would be resolved. She asked me to be her emergency contact and to help preserve her legacy because she knew I understood the work she was doing and could continue it effectively. That doesn't mean she loved me more than she loved you. It means she trusted me with a specific responsibility because she believed I was equipped to handle it. My explanation was intended to reassure my parents that Natalie's choices hadn't been about rejection or favoritism, but about matching responsibilities to capabilities. She had loved our entire family, but she had also been realistic about our different strengths and limitations, about the kinds of support each of us could provide for her military career and humanitarian work. She talked about you constantly during her deployments, I continued, hoping to ease some of their hurt by sharing information about Natalie's feelings that I had never thought to mention before. She worried about the stress her service caused you, and she was grateful for your support even when she knew you didn't fully understand what she was doing. She never wanted to burden you with the difficult aspects of her work, but she also needed someone who could help her process those experiences and continue her humanitarian efforts. The congregation listened to my words with the kind of intense attention that comes from witnessing a family crisis being resolved in real time, their expressions reflecting a mixture of sympathy for my parents' pain and respect for my attempt to bridge the gap between Natalie's wishes and their expectations. Some people were crying openly, moved by the complexity of love and loss that was being played out before them, while others seemed to be reconsidering their own family relationships in light of what they were witnessing. My mother, who had been struggling to maintain her composure throughout the exchange, finally broke down completely, her sobs echoing through the chapel as she processed the full implications of what she had learned. She wasn't crying just for Natalie's death, but for the discovery that her daughter's life had been more complex and significant than she had ever imagined, that opportunities for deeper understanding had been missed, that relationships she had taken for granted had been more fragile than she had realized. I just want to understand, she said through her tears, her voice breaking with the effort of speaking. I want to know who my daughter really was, what her life actually meant, why she felt she couldn't share these things with me. I want to know how to honor her memory properly, how to be proud of her in the right way. Her words revealed the heart of the conflict that had been exposed by the honor guard's presentation, the gap between the Natalie my parents had known and loved, and the Natalie who had been recognized and honored by the military. They weren't fighting against me or against the truth of my relationship with their daughter, but against their own sense of inadequacy, their fear that they had somehow failed as parents by not understanding or supporting the most important aspects of Natalie's adult life. Captain Brooks stepped forward once more, her expression softening as she recognized the genuine pain in my mother's voice, and the opportunity to provide information that might help heal the wounds that had been opened by the day's revelations. Mrs. Donovan, she said gently, your daughter spoke about you with tremendous love and gratitude. She understood that your worry came from caring, and she appreciated the way you supported her even when her choices frightened you. She reached into her folder one final time and withdrew a small envelope that bore Natalie's handwriting, a personal letter that had apparently been entrusted to military personnel for delivery in case of her death. Specialist Donovan asked me to give this to her family if anything happened to her. She wanted you to understand her choices, and to know that her love for you was never in question, even when her decisions might have seemed to exclude or diminish you. The sight of Natalie's handwriting on the envelope created a collective intake of breath throughout the chapel, as if the congregation recognized that they were about to witness something deeply personal and potentially transformative. My mother reached for the letter with trembling hands, her tears temporarily forgotten as she focused on this final communication from her youngest daughter. As she opened the envelope and began to read, her expression shifted from grief to wonder to something approaching peace. Whatever Natalie had written in that letter was providing the explanation and reassurance that my mother had been desperately seeking, the bridge between her understanding of their relationship and the reality of Natalie's choices about her military career and humanitarian work. She says, my mother whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly through the chapel's perfect acoustics. She says that she knew we would always love her no matter what, but that Claire was the person who could understand her work and help her continue it. She says she trusted us with her heart and Claire with her mission, and that both were equally important to her. The letter's message provided the framework for understanding Natalie's choices that had been missing throughout the confrontation, the explanation that allowed love and practicality to coexist without diminishing each other. She had made different arrangements for different aspects of her life based on people's strengths and capabilities, but she had never intended those arrangements to reflect the relative importance of her relationships with different family members. My father, who had been standing rigidly throughout the exchange, finally allowed his shoulders to slump as the tension drained out of his body. He looked at me with an expression that was no longer angry or defensive, but simply tired and sad, the face of a man who had been forced to confront the limitations of his understanding and the complexity of relationships he had thought were straightforward. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret.
I didn't understand. I thought family meant that everything should go through parents first. That we should be the ones making decisions about Natalie's legacy. I didn't realize that she had been building a different kind of family. One based on shared experiences rather than just shared blood. His apology was more than I had ever expected to receive. An acknowledgement that the military's decision to honor me had been based on legitimate factors rather than arbitrary preferences or bureaucratic errors. He was beginning to understand that Natalie's choices had been thoughtful and deliberate, that she had been trying to ensure that different aspects of her life and legacy were entrusted to the people best equipped to handle them. The chapel, which had been filled with tension and conflict just minutes earlier, began to settle into a different kind of quiet, one marked by understanding rather than confusion, by acceptance rather than resistance. The honor guard, which had maintained their formation throughout the entire confrontation, remained at attention as witnesses to the resolution that was beginning to emerge from the family crisis they had inadvertently precipitated. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward one final time, his expression reflecting satisfaction that the truth had been revealed and acknowledged without permanent damage to family relationships. "If I may," he said respectfully, "Specialist Donovan's legacy belongs to all of you in different ways. Mrs. and Mr. Donovan, you gave her the values and character that made her an exceptional soldier and humanitarian worker. Michael, you provided the example of leadership and responsibility that shaped her approach to military service. And Claire, you provided the understanding and support that allowed her to serve effectively and plan for the future." His words offered a framework for shared ownership of Natalie's legacy that honored everyone's contributions while acknowledging the specific role I had been asked to play in preserving and continuing her work. Rather than creating winners and losers, he was suggesting that Natalie's life and service had been enriched by different kinds of support from different family members, all of which had been necessary for her success and satisfaction. "The flag that has been presented to Claire," he continued, "represents not just recognition of her relationship with Specialist Donovan, but a responsibility to ensure that all of these contributions are remembered and honored. The goal is not to exclude anyone from Natalie's legacy, but to ensure that it is preserved and continued by the person best equipped to do so." As Staff Sergeant Rodriguez concluded his remarks, I felt the weight of responsibility settling even more heavily on my shoulders. The flag in my hands was not just a symbol of vindication but a commitment to honor everyone's relationship with Natalie while ensuring that her humanitarian work would continue in the most effective way possible. The vindication was complete, but the real work of healing and preservation was just beginning. The honor guard began to file out of the chapel with the same precision they had shown upon entering, their mission accomplished but their impact still reverberating through the community that had witnessed their presentation. As they disappeared through the heavy wooden doors, they left behind a family forever changed by the truth they had revealed. A congregation that had learned something profound about the complexity of love and service, and a legacy that would require careful tending by the person who had been chosen to preserve it. The vindication was complete, the truth had been acknowledged, and the foundation had been laid for whatever would come next. But as I stood there holding Natalie's flag, surrounded by the family that was only beginning to understand who their daughter and sister had really been, I knew that the most challenging part of this journey was still ahead. 6 months after Natalie's funeral, I stood in the community center on Elm Street watching as dozens of volunteers arranged tables and chairs for the monthly gathering of the Natalie Donovan Foundation. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the faces of military families, Afghan refugees, social workers, and community members who had come together to support the humanitarian work that had grown from my sister's legacy. The room buzzed with quiet conversation in multiple languages, the sound of connections being forged across cultural and geographic boundaries that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. The foundation had started as a simple commitment to honor Natalie's wishes, but it had evolved into something far more significant than I had ever imagined possible. Working with Captain Brooks and the Department of Veterans Affairs, we had formalized the nonprofit organization that Natalie had been planning, creating a structure that could support military families, facilitate ongoing relationships with Afghan communities, and provide resources for post-conflict reconstruction work around the world. The proposal that had been sitting in government files had become a living, breathing organization that touched lives across 3 continents. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. The weeks following the funeral had been filled with difficult conversations as my family worked to process the revelations that had emerged during the Honor Guard's presentation. My parents had struggled to reconcile their love for Natalie with their new understanding of the complexities of her service, while Michael had needed time to adjust his perception of family dynamics and his own role in preserving our sister's legacy. There had been moments of tension, misunderstanding, and hurt feelings as we all learned to navigate relationships that had been permanently altered by truth. But there had also been moments of profound connection and growth. My mother had thrown herself into learning about Natalie's humanitarian work, reading every letter and report with the determination of someone trying to know a daughter she realized she had never fully understood. She had become one of the Foundation's most dedicated volunteers, using her organizational skills and community connections to support fundraising events and outreach programs. Her motivation wasn't guilt or obligation, but genuine fascination with the scope of Natalie's impact and a desire to contribute meaningfully to preserving her legacy. My father had approached the situation with his characteristic methodical thoroughness, educating himself about military culture and international humanitarian work with the same attention to detail he brought to managing the hardware store. He had used his business connections to secure donations and establish partnerships with other community organizations, transforming his initial confusion and hurt into productive action that supported the Foundation's mission. His contribution was practical rather than emotional, but it was no less valuable for being grounded in pragmatism rather than sentiment. Michael had perhaps undergone the most significant transformation of all the family members. His initial resistance to accepting my role in Natalie's legacy had evolved into genuine respect for the work we were doing, and active participation in Foundation activities. He had used his leadership experience and business acumen to help establish the organizational structures that allowed the Foundation to operate efficiently and transparently. More importantly, he had become a bridge between the military families we served and the broader Millbrook community, helping to create understanding and support for people whose experiences had previously seemed foreign and incomprehensible to many local residents. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond what any of us had initially envisioned. We maintained correspondence with the Afghan families and communities that Natalie had served, facilitating ongoing relationships that provided mutual support and cultural exchange. We offered counseling and practical assistance to military families dealing with deployment, injury, and loss. We funded educational programs that helped veterans transition to civilian careers in humanitarian work and international development. Most importantly, we created spaces for people to share their stories and connect with others who understood their experiences. One of our most successful programs was the monthly storytelling dinner, where military families, Afghan refugees, and community members gathered to share meals and narratives that bridged cultural divides and created unexpected friendships. These gatherings had become a cornerstone of the Foundation's mission, providing the kind of personal connection that Natalie had always believed was essential to effective humanitarian work. The dinner had grown from a small gathering in my apartment to a community-wide event that required the space and resources of the Elm Street Community Center. As I watched the volunteers preparing for tonight's dinner, I thought about how different my life had become since that autumn morning when I had sat invisible in the back of St. Andrew's Memorial Chapel. The shy social worker who had felt erased by her own family had evolved into the director of an organization that was making tangible differences in the lives of people across multiple continents. The transformation hadn't been driven by ambition or a desire for recognition, but by the simple commitment to honor promises made to a sister who had trusted me with her most important work. The personal changes had been as significant as the professional ones. I had moved into a larger apartment that could accommodate the files and equipment necessary for Foundation operations, but more importantly, I had created a space that welcomed the constant stream of visitors, volunteers, and beneficiaries, who had become central to my daily life. My world had expanded from the narrow confines of county social services to encompass relationships with people whose backgrounds and experiences enriched my understanding of what it meant to serve others effectively. My relationship with my family had also been fundamentally transformed in ways that went beyond the immediate aftermath of the funeral revelations. The distance that had characterized our interactions for years had been replaced by a deeper appreciation for each other's strengths and contributions. My parents no longer saw me as the daughter who had chosen work that took her away from family concerns,
but as someone who had built expertise that benefited not just her immediate community, but also the broader mission of honoring their youngest daughter's legacy. The foundation had also attracted the attention of other organizations and individuals who were working on similar projects around the world. We had formed partnerships with humanitarian groups in Europe, educational institutions that were developing post-conflict reconstruction programs, and military organizations that were trying to improve their cultural competency and community engagement strategies. The work that had started as a personal commitment to preserve Natalie's story had become part of a larger movement that was changing how people thought about military service, international relations, and the responsibilities that came with global citizenship. Tonight's dinner would be particularly special because we were hosting a group of visitors from Afghanistan who had traveled to the United States specifically to honor Natalie's memory and to strengthen the relationships that had been built through her service. Among them was Dr. Rashid Ahmed, the medical director whose letter had been read at Natalie's funeral, and Fatima Karimi, the mother whose daughter had been comforted by Natalie during a medical procedure. Their presence represented the fulfillment of dreams that Natalie had shared with me during our late-night conversations, the possibility that military service could create lasting bonds that transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. The preparations for the dinner had taken weeks of coordination, involving immigration lawyers, cultural interpreters, and security personnel who understood the complexities of bringing Afghan civilians to a small Ohio town. But the effort had been worth it, not just for the symbolic value of the visit, but for the practical opportunities it created to strengthen ongoing relationships and develop new collaborative projects. The foundation had been working with Dr. Ahmed's clinic to establish a telemedicine program that would provide ongoing support and consultation, while Fatima's community was developing an educational exchange that would allow young people from both countries to learn about each other's cultures and experiences. As the first guests began to arrive for the dinner, I positioned myself near the entrance to welcome them and facilitate introductions between people who might not otherwise have opportunities to meet and connect. The diversity of the gathering never failed to amaze me. Military families sitting beside Afghan refugees, community leaders engaging in animated conversations with recent veterans, children from different cultural backgrounds playing together, while their parents shared stories of loss and resilience. Captain Brooks arrived with a small group of active-duty military personnel who were participating in the Foundation's mentorship program, an initiative that connected soldiers preparing for deployment with veterans who had experience in humanitarian work and cultural engagement. The program had become a model that was being replicated at military bases across the country, providing practical training that helped soldiers understand how to build positive relationships with civilian populations, rather than simply focusing on combat operations and security concerns. My parents entered together, my mother carrying a large casserole dish that would contribute to the evening's potluck dinner, my father following with the quiet dignity that had become his characteristic response to Foundation events. They had both become regular participants in these gatherings, not as leaders or organizers, but as community members who understood the value of the work being done and wanted to contribute their presence and support. Their transformation from confused and hurt parents to engaged community volunteers had been gradual but profound, reflecting their genuine commitment to understanding and honoring all aspects of Natalie's legacy. Michael arrived with his family, his children carrying art supplies for the evening's collaborative project that would create a mural representing the different cultures and experiences represented in the Foundation's work. His participation in Foundation activities had become an important part of his children's education about service, diversity, and the ways that individual actions could create positive change in the world. He had told me recently that his involvement with the Foundation had changed his perspective on his own business responsibilities and community obligations, inspiring him to use the hardware store as a platform for supporting local veterans and refugee families. As the room filled with conversation and laughter, I found myself thinking about the letter that had arrived that morning from the Department of Defense, informing me that the Foundation's work had been selected for official recognition and ongoing support through a new federal program that funded civilian organizations working to improve military-community relations. The recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it provided the financial stability that would allow us to expand our programs and reach more families who could benefit from the services we provided. The evening's program began with a welcome from Dr. Ahmed, who spoke about the lasting impact that Natalie's service had created in his community, and the ways that the Foundation's ongoing work was strengthening relationships between Afghanistan and the United States. His words were translated for the English-speaking attendees, but his emotion and sincerity needed no interpretation, reaching across language barriers, to touch everyone in the room, who understood the universal experiences of loss, gratitude, and hope. Fatima spoke next, sharing the story of her daughter's medical treatment, and the comfort that Natalie had provided during a frightening and uncertain time. She presented the foundation with a traditional Afghan textile that had been created by women in her village specifically to honor Natalie's memory, a beautiful piece of art that would be displayed in the foundation's office, as a reminder of the personal connections that gave meaning to our work. When it was my turn to speak, I found myself thinking not about the formal remarks I had prepared, but about the promise I had made to Natalie in my apartment more than a year earlier. The commitment to preserve her legacy and continue her work had evolved into something far more comprehensive and impactful than either of us had imagined possible, but the core mission remained the same, ensuring that the connections she had built and the compassion she had shown would continue to create positive change in the world. Natalie always believed, I told the gathering, that military service was about more than protecting American interests or advancing political objectives. She believed it was about building bridges between people, creating understanding across cultural boundaries, and using whatever privilege and resources we have to help others tell their stories and achieve their dreams. I looked around the room at the faces that represented so many different backgrounds and experiences, all brought together by a shared commitment to the values that Natalie had embodied during her too brief life. The foundation exists not to memorialize the past, but to continue the work that she started, to honor her memory by creating more opportunities for connection, understanding, and mutual support. The formal program concluded with a collaborative art project that brought together adults and children, native English speakers, and recent immigrants, military personnel and civilians, all working side by side to create something beautiful and meaningful that would represent their shared commitment to building a more compassionate and connected world. The mural that emerged from their collective efforts was vibrant and complex, incorporating symbols and images from multiple cultures, while maintaining a coherent vision of hope and possibility. As the evening wound down and guests began to say their goodbyes, I found myself in conversation with a young Afghan woman named Layla, who had recently arrived in the United States as a refugee. She was struggling to navigate the complexities of American bureaucracy, while trying to establish a life for herself and her family in a completely foreign environment. Her story reminded me of the challenges that Natalie had described witnessing during her deployments, the difficulties faced by people caught between worlds, and trying to build better futures, despite overwhelming obstacles. Layla's presence at the dinner represented both the success of the Foundation's work and the ongoing challenges that required continued attention and support. Through connections established by the Foundation, she had been able to access housing assistance, educational resources, and community support that had eased her transition to life in Ohio. But she also represented thousands of other refugees and immigrants who needed similar support and advocacy, reminding me that the work we were doing was just the beginning of what needed to be accomplished. As the last guests departed and the volunteers finished cleaning up the community center, I stood alone in the empty room, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The invisible daughter who had sat in the back of St. Andrew's Memorial Chapel had become the director of an organization that was creating tangible change in the lives of people around the world. The sister who had been forgotten during Natalie's funeral service had become the keeper of her legacy and the architect of its continued growth and impact. But perhaps most importantly, I had become someone who understood that family was not just about shared blood or common last names, but about the connections formed through mutual support, shared values, and collaborative work toward common goals. The Foundation had created a family that included my biological relatives, but extended far beyond them to encompass people whose backgrounds and experiences enriched my understanding of what it meant to serve others effectively. The transformation hadn't erased the pain of losing Natalie, or the hurt that had come from feeling invisible and unappreciated for so many years. But it had given meaning to that pain, creating something positive and lasting from the grief and confusion that had characterized the immediate aftermath of her death. The promises I had made to her in my small apartment had evolved into commitments that connected me to communities around the world, responsibilities that gave purpose and direction to my life in ways I had never expected. As I locked up the community center and walked to my car in the crisp evening air, I thought about the email I would write tomorrow to Dr. Ahmad and Fatima, thanking them for their visit and confirming plans for the next phase of our collaborative projects. I thought about the grant proposal I needed to finish for a program that would bring more Afghan refugees to Ohio and help them establish successful lives in American communities. I thought about the upcoming conference, where I would present the Foundation's work to other humanitarian organizations and military leaders who were interested in replicating our model in their own communities. Most of all, I thought about Natalie and the conversation we would have if she could see what had grown from the seed she had planted during her military service. I imagined her surprise at the scope of the Foundation's work, her pride in the connections that had been strengthened and expanded, her satisfaction at knowing that her humanitarian efforts had continued to create positive change long after her own service had ended. The drive home took me past St. Andrew's Memorial Chapel, where a small memorial garden had been established in Natalie's honor, with funding from the Foundation and support from the congregation. The garden featured plants and flowers from different regions of the world, representing the global nature of her service and the international connections that had been forged through her work. A simple stone marker bore her name, her dates of service, and a quote from one of the letters written by Afghan villagers. She helped us see that soldiers could be friends. The memorial garden was more than a place of remembrance. It had become a gathering spot for Foundation activities, a quiet space where military families could come to process their grief and connect with others who understood their experiences. The garden represented the transformation of a painful loss into something beautiful and meaningful, a living symbol of the ways that individual service could create lasting positive change in the world. As I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, I noticed a package waiting outside my door, a small box bearing international postmarks and careful handwriting that I recognized as belonging to one of the Afghan families the Foundation had been working with. Inside was a hand-carved wooden box containing letters from children in Dr. Ahmad's community, drawings and messages that would be added to the Foundation's collection of testimonials and shared with military families who needed reminders that their service had created positive impacts in the lives of real people. The letters were written in careful English, translated from Dari, by local teachers who wanted the children's words to reach American audiences directly. They told stories of schools that had been rebuilt with American assistance, medical clinics that had been improved through military support, and personal relationships that had been formed with soldiers who had taken the time to learn about local culture and customs. Each letter was a testament to the kind of service that Natalie had embodied, the approach to military work that prioritized connection and understanding alongside security and combat readiness. Reading through the letters, I felt the familiar mixture of pride and sadness that had become characteristic of my relationship with Natalie's legacy. Pride in the positive impact she had created, sadness that she wasn't here to see how that impact had continued to grow and evolve. But also hope, because the Foundation had ensured that her approach to service would continue to influence new generations of military personnel and civilian humanitarian workers who understood that effective service required both professional competence and personal compassion. The work that had started as a promise to a dying sister had become a calling that defined my daily life and long-term aspirations. The Foundation was no longer just about preserving Natalie's memory, but about creating ongoing opportunities for the kind of service she had believed in. The approach to military and humanitarian work that prioritized building bridges over maintaining barriers, that celebrated connection over division, that recognized the humanity in every person, regardless of their nationality, religion, or cultural background. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how different my life had become since that morning, when I had stood invisible in the back of a funeral chapel, watching my family mourn a version of my sister that bore little resemblance to the woman I had known and loved. The vindication that had come through the honor guard's presentation had been important, but it had been only the beginning of a transformation that had changed not just how my family saw me, but how I saw myself and my place in the world. The Foundation had given me a voice and a platform that extended far beyond the boundaries of Millbrook, Ohio, connecting me to communities and causes that enriched my understanding of what it meant to serve others effectively. The work had also reunited me with my family in ways that went beyond our biological connections, creating shared purposes and collaborative projects that strengthened our relationships while honoring Natalie's memory. But perhaps most importantly, the Foundation had taught me that being forgotten or overlooked could be transformed into an opportunity to create something meaningful and lasting. The invisibility that had characterized my relationship with my family for so many years had been replaced by a visibility that came not from demanding recognition, but from quietly building something valuable that others wanted to support and participate in. The last thing I did before turning off the light was to look at the folded flag that sat in a place of honor on my dresser, the symbol of recognition that had changed everything, and the reminder of responsibilities that would continue for the rest of my life. The flag represented not just vindication for the past, but commitment to the future, the promise that Natalie's legacy would continue to create positive change in the world, through the work of people who understood that true service meant seeing and honoring the humanity in every person we encountered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, more letters to answer, more programs to develop, more connections to facilitate between people whose backgrounds and experiences could enrich each other's understanding of what it meant to build a more compassionate and connected world. The work would never be finished, but that was what made it meaningful, the knowledge that every day brought new possibilities to honor Natalie's memory, by continuing the work she had started and expanding it in ways she had only dreamed of achieving. The invisible daughter had become visible, not through confrontation or demand, but through quiet service that created value for others. The forgotten sister had been remembered not just by her family, but by communities around the world, who understood that her legacy lived on through the work of people who shared her commitment to building bridges, creating understanding, and using whatever privileges and resources they possessed to help others tell their stories and achieve their dreams. The transformation was complete, but the work was just beginning, and that was exactly as it should be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.